I have worked underwater for most of my adult life. Commercial diving trains you to think in systems. Air supply, time at depth, redundancy, failure points. Fear is treated as another variable. Manageable if you respect it. Lethal if you pretend it does not exist. The offer came through a contractor I trusted. The message was short. Deep sea assignment. Long rotation. Exceptional pay. The rate alone told me something was wrong. It was almost double what saturation work usually paid. There was no hazard bonus listed. No location beyond a grid square far from established routes. When I asked why the pay was so high, the recruiter said it was due to retention issues. That was the first answer that did not sit right. Retention problems usually mean bad management or dangerous conditions. Those are things divers talk about. This job came with silence instead. The paperwork arrived in a sealed packet. Non-disclosure agreements thicker than any contract I had signed before. Clauses about perception, interpretation, and behavioral compliance. Those words stood out to me. They were not standard legal language for offshore work. There was no mention of what we would be building or repairing. Just maintenance, monitoring, depth-related operations. The medical screening was more invasive than usual. Psych evaluations repeated twice by different doctors. They asked questions about attention, about pattern recognition, about how I handled ambiguity. I assumed they were filtering out people prone to panic. That seemed reasonable. I passed without issue. Transport took me out by helicopter to a vessel that did not appear on any public registry. No company logo, no flag, just a gray hull and a helipad painted over so many times the markings were barely visible. The crew did not greet me the way offshore crews usually do. There was no handshake circle, no quick jokes to test personality. They nodded. They checked my name. They moved on. I noticed how quiet everyone was. Not tense. Controlled. The ship itself was massive. Built for long endurance. Deep water operations. Redundant systems layered on top of each other. Everything was over-engineered. That costs money. Companies only do that when failure is unacceptable. My bunk was already assigned. My gear locker labeled. Even my coffee mug sat waiting with my name etched into it. That unsettled me more than the depth rating. At dinner, no one asked where I had worked before. No one bragged. No one complained about previous jobs. Conversation stayed shallow. Weather, schedules, food quality. When I mentioned saturation depth experience, the table went quiet. Not awkward. Intentional. One of the supervisors changed the subject immediately. After the meal, I was called to a briefing room. No windows. Low lighting. A long table with a single binder placed in front of each chair. The supervisor introduced himself by last name only. He did not explain the mission. He did not describe objectives. He told us the rules governed all activity on board and below it. He said safety depended on compliance more than skill. That was a strange thing to say to divers. He did not answer questions. He instructed us to read. The binder was thicker than expected. Hundreds of pages. Tabs marked by color rather than topic. Behavioral. Environmental. Cognitive. I flipped through sections quickly. Many rules repeated with minor wording changes. Some applied only after certain depths. Others applied only after specific durations underwater. One page caught my attention. It was printed in bold text, centered, isolated from the rest. Never acknowledged the Leviathan below. No definition followed. No context. No explanation. I assumed it was metaphor. Divers use language like that sometimes. Nicknames for currents or pressure effects. But the rule appeared again. And again. Referenced across multiple sections. In behavioral compliance. In emergency protocols. In psychological response management. Always written the same way. Never acknowledged the Leviathan below. I looked around the room. No one reacted. No raised eyebrows. No smirks. This was normal to them. The supervisor finally spoke again. He said the rules were written in blood. He said improvisation was not encouraged. He said curiosity was a liability at depth. Then he dismissed us. Back in my bunk, I read the binder carefully. The rules address things no manual should. How long to maintain eye contact with nothing. How to respond if sound patterns repeated. What to do if you felt watched but could not identify a source. Most rules did not describe danger. They described responses. That is when I understood something important. The rules assumed exposure. They assumed we would encounter whatever required them. They did not try to prevent contact. They tried to manage behavior after it happened. I slept poorly that night. Not because I was scared. Because I could not identify the threat. Fear needs shape. Even abstract fear needs context. This was something else. An absence of explanation where one should exist. The next morning, we began preparations for saturation. The chamber was already pressurized. Helium mixture ready. Life support humming steadily. As I suited up, one of the veteran divers adjusted my gear silently. He paused longer than necessary. Without looking at me, he said one sentence. Read the rules again at depth. Then he walked away. I asked the supervisor what we were maintaining. He said infrastructure. I asked what kind. He said legacy systems. That was the end of the conversation. As the chamber sealed and pressure began to increase, I felt the familiar squeeze in my ears. The comforting discomfort of a job I understood. But something felt wrong already. Not the equipment. Not the process. The certainty with which everyone behaved. Like they were not preventing an accident. Like they were maintaining a boundary. I had not even entered the water yet. And already, the rules felt closer than the ocean itself. The binder was waiting for me outside the saturation control room. My name was printed on the spine in block letters. No job title. No company logo. It felt heavier than it should have. Not just in weight. In intent. The supervisor handed it to me without ceremony. He did not explain its contents. He did not ask if I had questions. He told me to keep it with me at all times while at depth. Not in my locker. Not in common areas. With me. That alone told me it was not a normal safety manual. I sat at a metal table and opened it. The first page was a statement of compliance. By remaining assigned to this operation, I acknowledged responsibility for following all rules regardless of personal interpretation or understanding. That wording bothered me. It removed intent from the equation. Understanding was not required. Only obedience. The rules were numbered, but the numbering did not follow a logical sequence. Some sections repeated earlier rules verbatim with minor changes. Others contradicted standard dive training. Rule 4.3 instructed divers to avoid unnecessary downward orientation beyond task requirements. Rule 7.1 stated that downward orientation was unavoidable and outlined acceptable durations. Rule 9.8 explained how to recover composure if orientation caused emotional response. This was not redundancy. It was escalation. Many rules were not about equipment or decompression. They were about attention, focus, interpretation. One rule instructed divers not to count repeating pulses in the water. Another specified acceptable breathing patterns if rhythmic sound was perceived. Sound was mentioned often. So was stillness. There were entire sections dedicated to what not to do when nothing was visible. That made no sense on the surface. I reached the page I had noticed during the briefing. Never acknowledged the Leviathan below. It appeared again. Always the same phrasing. Capitalized. Isolated. Sometimes it was listed as a primary rule. Sometimes as a subclause. Sometimes referenced indirectly as the non-acknowledgement requirement. Never defined. Never explained. I looked for a glossary. There was none. I flipped to the back. No index. No authorship. No revision history. Only a final page that stated all rules were subject to amendment without notice. I asked a senior diver about it during equipment checks. He had been on the vessel longer than most. His gear was worn but meticulously maintained. I pointed to the line in the binder. I asked what it meant. He did not look at the page. He did not look at me. He said it meant exactly what it said. I asked what the Leviathan was. He tightened a bolt with slow precision. Then he stood up. He told me that asking questions was not forbidden, but expecting answers was a mistake. Another diver nearby laughed quietly. Not mockingly. Nervously. They treated the rule the way people treat gravity. Not with fear. With acceptance. Back in my bunk, I compared the binder to standard offshore protocols I had memorized over the years. There were discrepancies. Emergency ascent procedures were delayed in certain conditions without explanation. Visual confirmation was discouraged at depths where visibility should be highest. Divers were instructed to log anomalies without description. Log, not describe. That distinction mattered. The binder governed perception more than action. It told us how to experience what we encountered, what conclusions we were allowed to form. One rule instructed divers to use neutral language when reporting unusual sensations. Another prohibited metaphors. Do not assign intent. Do not assign scale. Do not assign agency. Those words appeared often. Agency. That was not a word used in diving manuals. I realized the binder was not trying to keep us safe. It was trying to keep something stable. During a pre-saturation briefing, the supervisor referenced the rules again. He reminded us that deviation would result in immediate removal from duty. Not disciplinary action. Removal. I asked where removed divers went. He said they were reassigned. I asked where. He said not here. That answer ended the conversation. As pressure increased inside the chamber, I kept the binder close. The helium made voices thin and strange. The hum of life support filled the space. I read the rules again. Slower this time. I noticed how often the rules anticipated emotional responses. Dread. Curiosity. Recognition. Recognition appeared more than once. If recognition occurs, disengage immediately. If recognition persists, follow grounding procedures. If recognition escalates, do not vocalize. Recognition of what was never specified. At depth, sound travels differently. Light behaves differently. Your own body feels foreign. The binder assumed all of that. It went further. It assumed the environment could respond. That was not written directly. It did not need to be. The implication was everywhere. Never acknowledge the Leviathan below. The rule did not say never see it. It did not say never hear it. It said never acknowledge. Acknowledgement requires understanding. It requires confirmation. It requires the idea that something is there. I began to understand why no one would explain it. Explanation itself might count. When we finally entered the water days later, the rules were repeated again over comms. Not the technical ones, the behavioral ones. Maintain task focus. Avoid downward fixation. Report anomalies without interpretation. And above all, never acknowledge the Leviathan below. I descended slowly, guided by lights and lines. The darkness below absorbed illumination instead of reflecting it. I told myself it was a trick of depth, of sediment, of perception, but the binder had prepared me for that thought. It had anticipated denial as well. As I worked, I felt watched, not in a way I could point to. Not like eyes, more like attention. The rules did not say that was impossible. They explained what to do when it happened. I followed them. I did not look longer than necessary. I did not listen beyond task requirements. I did not describe what I felt. I logged neutral observations. Pressure stable. Sound present. No visual confirmation. The binder was not superstition. It was field tested. Every rule felt like it existed because someone had done the opposite. Someone had looked too long. Someone had listened too closely. Someone had decided that noticing was harmless. They did not come back. When the dive ended and I returned to the chamber, no one asked how it felt. No one asked what I saw. They only asked one thing. Did you follow the rules? I said yes. That was the correct answer. But lying to myself was already becoming harder, because something about the binder was clear now. The rules were not designed to protect us from the deep. They were designed to protect the deep from us. Or maybe, to protect us from being noticed in return. And the fact that such a rule existed at all told me one thing with certainty. Whatever waited below did not need us to believe in it. It only needed us to recognize it. And recognition was the one thing we were never allowed to give. The first deep descent did not begin with urgency. There were no alarms, no rushed commands. Everything moved with deliberate calm. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. The mission briefing was brief to the point of meaninglessness. Inspect anchor points. Verify structural integrity. Log environmental conditions. Nothing in that list required the depth we were scheduled to reach. I noticed that immediately. The target depth was several hundred meters below what would normally be necessary for inspection or maintenance. I checked the numbers twice, assuming a clerical error. There was none. When I asked the dive supervisor to confirm, he did not correct me. He simply repeated the depth back to me, as if saying it again made it reasonable. The chamber sealed. Pressure increased slowly. The familiar sensations returned. Heat, compression, the faint metallic taste of helium. My body adjusted the way it always did. Physically, nothing was wrong. That was the unsettling part. When we transferred from the chamber into open water, visibility was better than expected. clear enough to see the structure lines disappearing into the dark below. The descent line stretched down like a thread into nothing. I began the drop. At first, the ocean behaved normally. Light faded gradually. Sound flattened. The water grew colder. Then, somewhere past a depth I had logged dozens of times in my career, the change became noticeable. Not dramatic. Subtle. The darkness below was thicker than it should have been. Not just darker, but heavier. My lights cut through less water than expected. The beam did not scatter. It stopped, as if the light was being absorbed rather than reflected. I checked my equipment. Power was stable. Output normal. The ocean did not care. Sonar pings returned inconsistent readings. Objects appeared and vanished between sweeps. The system flagged interference. I logged it as instructed. Interference. That word was used often. The dive supervisor spoke through comms. His voice was calm. Even. He did not comment on the readings. He reminded me of the rules. Maintain orientation. Avoid unnecessary downward focus. Continue descent. No mention of task objectives. That struck me then. The job was not inspection. The job was descent. As I moved deeper, pressure behaved strangely. Not dangerously. Not painfully. Just wrong. My body felt compressed unevenly, like the water was pressing from one direction more than others. That is not how pressure works. Training tells you pressure is uniform. Relentless but equal. This felt directional. I adjusted my breathing. Checked my gauges again. Everything read within acceptable limits. The problem was not physical. The environment felt crowded. That is the only word that fits. Not full. Crowded, as if the space below was already occupied. The structure I was meant to inspect came into view. A massive anchor point embedded into the seabed. I did not remember it being that large. Scale felt unreliable down there. Distances seemed distorted. I focused on the task. Ran my checks. Logged corrosion levels. The supervisor did not comment on my progress. He repeated a rule instead. Do not linger. I completed the inspection faster than required. Prepared to ascend. That is when I noticed something else. The water below the anchor point moved. Not a current. Not turbulence. It shifted as a whole. Sediment lifted gently, then settled back down in a pattern too slow to be accidental. My lights did not reveal a source. I felt the urge to angle downward. Just slightly. To see. The binder had warned about this. Downward fixation. I forced my gaze back to the structure. Logged the movement as environmental disturbance. Neutral language. My heart rate increased. Not from exertion. From something closer to anticipation. The supervisor spoke again. This time his voice was firmer. Continue ascent. No questions asked. As I rose, the darkness followed me longer than it should have. Light returned slowly. Reluctantly. It felt like leaving something behind that noticed my absence. Back in the chamber, decompression began. No one spoke. I expected at least a technical review. Some discussion of the sonar anomalies. None came. Instead, the supervisor asked one question. Did you follow the rules? I said yes. He nodded. That was the end of the debrief. Later, while resting, I reviewed the dive data myself. The sonar logs were incomplete. Sections were missing. Not corrupted. Removed. I asked the system's technician about it. He told me the system filtered irrelevant data automatically. I asked what qualified as irrelevant. He said anything that did not affect the mission. That answer bothered me, because the mission was never clearly defined. Over the next few days, I learned that all divees followed a similar pattern. Descents beyond necessity, minimal task engagement, strict behavioral compliance. The depth itself was the constant, not the work. Divers who reached certain depths were rotated off active duty sooner. Not due to fatigue, due to exposure limits. Exposure to what was never specified. I began to feel changes in myself. Nothing dramatic. A heightened awareness of sound. A tendency to listen longer than needed. The binder warned about that too. I forced myself to stop. At night, I dreamed of pressure without weight, of depth without water. I woke with the sensation of being observed from below my bed. That made no sense, but sense was becoming less reliable. Before my next dive, the supervisor reviewed the rules with me again. He emphasized one section: never assign meaning to environmental response. I asked what that meant. He said the environment does not respond. I asked why the rule existed then. He did not answer. The next descent was scheduled even deeper. I realized then that the operation was not reacting to something unexpected. It was maintaining contact with something known. The depth was not a hazard zone. It was a boundary, and every dive pushed against it slightly. Testing, measuring, not the ocean. Us. As I prepared for that next descent, I understood something that made my hands shake inside my gloves. The rules were not about preventing disaster. They were about preventing recognition. And whatever lay below did not announce itself. It waited, patient, as if depth itself was listening. And we were descending not into danger, but into attention. The sound started before I realized I was listening. At first, I thought it was equipment noise, a vibration in the suit, a harmonic from the pumps, something structural carrying through the frame. Those things happen at depth. The ocean is full of noise if you know how to hear it. This was different. It was not loud. It did not spike or fluctuate. It pressed inward. I noticed it while securing a line near the seafloor. The task was simple, mechanical. My hands moved automatically. The sound came through my helmet speakers first. A low tone, too low to register as a clear pitch. I checked the audio feed. Normal. Then I felt it in my chest. Not vibration. Resonance. Like my body had become part of the medium carrying it. I froze for a second. That was a mistake. The rules warned against stillness during unclassified sound exposure. Stillness encouraged listening. I resumed movement immediately. The sound did not stop. It did not grow louder either. It stayed exactly the same. I tried to locate a direction. That failed. It was everywhere and nowhere. Not surrounding me. Passing through me. I checked my instruments again. Sonar showed nothing unusual. Audio logs showed baseline noise only. No spikes. No anomalies. The sound existed outside the systems designed to detect it. That realization unsettled me more than the sound itself. I reported it the way the binder instructed. Unidentified low-frequency presence. No directional source. No associated vibration. Neutral language. The supervisor acknowledged the report without comment. He did not ask follow-up questions. He reminded me of a rule. Do not listen longer than necessary. That wording bothered me. Listening was not optional. I could not stop hearing it. What he meant was attention. Do not focus. I counted my breaths, focused on task sequence, forced my awareness back into procedure. The sound faded slightly when I did that. Not disappeared. Dulled, as if it receded when ignored. That was when I understood the danger. It responded to attention. I glanced at another diver working several meters away. He was older, experienced. His movements were precise but rushed. He avoided looking at me. I keyed my comms and asked if he heard it. There was a pause, longer than normal. Then he answered, "Yes." One word, nothing else. I asked what it sounded like. Another pause, longer this time. He told me not to describe it. He said description made it clearer. That sentence raised my heart rate more than anything else. The rules mentioned sound exposure limits. Time-based. I checked the binder section in my wrist-mounted copy. Maximum continuous listening duration listed. Mandatory disengagement period afterward. As if listening was an action. As if the sound waited to be received. I reached the time limit. I pulled back from the work area as instructed. Increased distance from the seafloor. The sound weakened. Not because of depth change. Because of separation. That distinction mattered. As I ascended slightly, the water below shifted again. Not visually. Audibly. The sound changed pattern. I almost missed it. Almost. It was not a rhythm. It was spacing. Intervals. Structured. Not random noise. Not geological activity. There was intention in the gaps. That thought felt dangerous the moment it formed. The binder warned against assigning intent. I forced the idea away. Logged another neutral entry. The supervisor instructed me to terminate the dive early. No explanation given. Back in the chamber, decompression began. The sound lingered. Faint. Distant. I pressed my helmet to the chamber wall. It disappeared. I pulled back. It returned. I did not report that. Some things were better left undocumented. Later, during mealtime, I sat with a group of divers who had been on the operation for years. No one spoke about the dive. I asked carefully about sound exposure. They all acknowledged it existed. None described it. One diver said the sound changed depending on how long you had been there. Another said it learned you. That earned him a sharp look from the supervisor across the room. He corrected himself immediately. He said it adjusted. Neutral language. I noticed how careful they were with words, as if vocabulary itself carried risk. One diver told me the rules used to be shorter, less specific, before the sound pattern stabilized. That sentence stayed with me. Stabilized meant repeated. Repeated meant consistent. Consistent meant deliberate. That night the sound returned in my sleep. I dreamed of pressure waves passing through empty space, of distance measured in time rather than meters. I woke with my jaw clenched. My ears rang. Medical checks showed nothing abnormal. No tinnitus. No decompression issues. Perfect health. The next dive briefing included a new emphasis. Sound exposure protocols were reiterated. Listening limits reduced slightly. No one explained why. The rules evolved. That meant the environment was not static. It was responding. I began to realize that the Leviathan rule was not about sight. It was about recognition across senses. Sound was safer than sight, but not by much. I reviewed the binder again. A sentence I had overlooked stood out. Auditory acknowledgement precedes visual confirmation in most cases. That implied cases where visual confirmation existed. I closed the binder. Some knowledge carried weight. The sound did not frighten me anymore. That scared me more than fear ever could. It had become familiar. And familiarity was the first step toward acknowledgement. The rules were not meant to protect us from noise. They were meant to prevent conversation. Because the sound was not a warning. It was a presence. Waiting. Patient. And the longer you listened, the clearer it became that it was not calling out. It was listening back. The diver who disappeared had been on the vessel longer than anyone else. Longer than the supervisor. Longer than the system's techs who rotated in and out. People called him a veteran, but not with admiration. With distance. He was the kind of diver whose presence lowered tension without effort. Quiet, efficient, unmistakably competent. He never rushed. He never asked questions. That alone made him stand out. The day he vanished started like every other controlled operation. Routine checks. Calm voices over comms. No indication that anything unusual was expected. The dive parameters were conservative. Depth well within limits we had already exceeded dozens of times. The task was simple structural verification near the seafloor. I was not on that dive. I monitored from inside the chamber, listening to comms. Everything sounded normal. Then there was a pause. Not silence. Open channel with no voice. The supervisor did not react immediately. He waited exactly 6 seconds before speaking. Status check. No response. Another 6 seconds. Repeat. Still nothing. There was no panic. No raised voices. The supervisor initiated protocol with mechanical precision. Abort operation. Begin retrieval. The retrieval failed. Officially, the report listed an equipment malfunction. A sudden pressure breach. Catastrophic failure. Those things happen. They happen fast. But they leave evidence. There was none. The diver's suit telemetry cut out cleanly. No pressure spike. No stress indicators. No distress signal. Just absence. What unsettled me most was not the loss itself. It was the crew's reaction. There was no moment of shock. No gathering. No hushed conversations. Instead, they moved into something that felt rehearsed. The supervisor closed the dive board and erased the diver's name. No ceremony. 2 crew members went to his locker immediately. They emptied it. Not carefully. Efficiently. Personal items were bagged and removed from the deck within minutes. His bunk was stripped before the next shift. It was as if he had never been there. I asked another diver what happened. He did not answer. He handed me a fresh copy of the rules binder instead. A revised edition. 1 page had been updated. A listening duration had been shortened. That was the only change. Later, during a maintenance window, I found myself alone with one of the older divers. Not the oldest, but close. He had known the missing diver well. I asked him quietly if the equipment report was accurate. He stared at the wall for a long time. Then he said no. I asked what really happened. He told me the diver had acknowledged something below. He did not say what. He did not need to. I asked how he knew. He said the diver had stopped following the rules. Not recklessly, intentionally. I pressed for clarification. He explained it carefully, choosing words like stepping stones. Curiosity breaks rules accidentally. Acknowledgement breaks them on purpose. That distinction mattered. The diver had not panicked. He had not chased a sensation. He had recognized something. And recognition was mutual. The older diver told me the Leviathan did not take people violently. It did not grab or crush. It accepted. That word made my skin prickle. Accepted implied consent. I asked what acknowledgement looked like. The diver shook his head. He said it was subtle. A pause too long. A shift in focus. A decision to look again. Once made, it could not be undone. The rules existed to prevent that moment. After the disappearance, operations continued. No delays. No investigations. The vessel did not return to port. That told me everything I needed to know. This was expected. Not frequent, but expected. I noticed changes in crew behavior. Divers avoided discussing depth thresholds. They spoke less during meals. Everyone reviewed the binder more often. The Leviathan rule was highlighted. Never acknowledge. Not never see. Not never hear. Never recognize. I realized then that acknowledgement was not about belief. It was about classification. The diver had crossed from observer to participant. That was not allowed. I began paying closer attention to myself, to moments when patterns formed too clearly, when sounds felt structured, when movement suggested intent. Each time I disengaged, I followed the rules. The missing diver's name was never spoken again, not even in whispers. It was as if language itself was part of the ritual. Later, I accessed the dive logs from that day. Most entries were standard. One line stood out. Final note recorded by diver. Acknowledged. Nothing else. No object. No description. Just the word. That chilled me more than any imagined monster. Acknowledgement was not an accident. It was a choice. The diver had chosen to see the thing below as something real, something present, and in doing so, he had made himself visible in return. That was the true danger. Not the depth, not the pressure. The moment you decided the ocean was not empty. The rules were not superstition. They were containment, not of a creature, of a relationship. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, listening to the hum of the ship. The sound from below did not return. That worried me more than if it had. Silence meant distance, or attention withdrawn. I did not know which was worse. What I did know was this. The veteran had not died. He had been removed, and whatever waited below had not taken him by force. It had responded to being recognized. That meant the Leviathan did not hunt. It waited, and the rules were the only thing keeping us from stepping forward and saying yes. I noticed the camera problem because it did not behave like a problem. On most vessels, camera failures cause frustration. Technicians argue. Engineers troubleshoot. Someone swears it worked yesterday. Here, no one reacted. The first time I saw it, I was reviewing dive footage after a routine descent. The camera feed was clear while aimed laterally. Structures sharp. Sediment visible. Lighting stable. Then the camera angle shifted downward. The image degraded instantly. Not static. Not pixelation. The picture softened. Edges blurred. Contrast collapsed. As soon as the camera tilted back up, clarity returned. I assumed it was a calibration issue. The system's engineer did not agree. He watched the playback with mild interest, like someone observing weather. He told me the cameras were operating within expected parameters. I asked expected for what? He said for this depth. I checked the camera specifications myself. They were rated well beyond our operational range. Pressure tolerant, low light capable. There was no technical reason for directional failure. The rules binder had a section on camera operation. Not maintenance, operation. It instructed divers and technicians to avoid prolonged downward recording beyond task requirements. If image degradation occurred, reposition the camera. Do not attempt to enhance or stabilize. Do not diagnose. That word again. Diagnosis implied understanding. Understanding led to classification. Classification led to acknowledgement. The engineers followed the rules without question. They treated the blind spots as environmental constants, like salinity, like thermoclines. I started watching camera feeds during other dives. The pattern repeated. Any attempt to look directly below a certain depth resulted in loss of detail. Not complete blackout, just enough to prevent interpretation. The ocean beneath became textureless, depth without shape. I asked an engineer if the system filtered data automatically. He said yes. I asked what it filtered. He said anything that exceeded processing tolerance. I asked what exceeded tolerance. He said downward complexity. That phrase made no sense. Complexity is not directional, unless what lies below contains more information than the system can resolve, or than it is allowed to. I began to understand that the cameras were not failing. They were refusing, either by design or by necessity. I learned that early versions of the operation had more extensive visual coverage. Full-spectrum cameras, high-resolution sonar mapping. Those systems were removed over time, not upgraded. Removed. I asked why. The answer was simple. Too many anomalies. Anomalies meant questions. Questions led to attention. The absence of imagery became a rule in itself. Divers learned not to rely on visuals. Technicians learned not to enhance feeds. Supervisors learned to ignore missing data. Seeing less kept things stable. The irony was difficult to ignore. We trusted our lives to equipment that was intentionally blind. During one dive, a camera feed accidentally remained angled downward longer than permitted. The image did not degrade immediately. For a few seconds it held. I was watching live. The water below appeared wrong. Not dark, compressed, like depth folded inward on itself. Then the feed softened and blurred. The engineer cut it manually. He did not ask what I saw. He did not want to know. Later I checked the logs. That segment was missing. Not corrupted. Deleted. I confronted the engineer privately. I asked if he removed it. He said no. He said the system did. I asked how the system knew. He said it always did. That answer told me everything. The cameras were not just limited. They were governed by the same principles as the rules binder. Never acknowledge. A clear image invites interpretation. Interpretation invites recognition. The technology existed to see more. It was restrained to prevent it. The absence of imagery became oppressive. When you cannot see, your mind fills gaps. The rules address that too. Do not speculate. Do not imagine. Do not infer. The binder was trying to starve the mind of shape, because shape gives things boundaries, and boundaries make them real. I noticed divers avoiding camera monitors subconsciously. They focused on tools, on gauges, anything but the empty space below the frame. During one briefing, a junior tech asked why the cameras were not upgraded. The room went quiet. The supervisor answered calmly, "Because clarity is dangerous." No one laughed. The question was never asked again. I began to understand that the Leviathan was not hidden. It was unrenderable, not invisible, unresolvable. Too much scale, too much structure, more than human perception could hold without breaking into meaning. The cameras failed not because they were weak, but because they were honest. And honesty was the one thing the operation could not afford. I stopped trying to see. I stopped reviewing footage beyond what was required. That felt like compliance. It also felt like relief. Because the worst moments were not when the feed went dark. They were when it almost worked. When clarity hovered just short of recognition. That edge was where the veteran had crossed, where acknowledgement happened. The rules were not preventing us from seeing a monster. They were preventing us from completing an image. Because once you complete it, you give it a place in your mind. And once it has a place, it can look back. The cameras were limited because sight was the fastest path to acknowledgement. Sound took time. Feeling took longer. Vision was immediate. And immediacy was dangerous. So the ocean below remained blurred. Not hidden, just unfinished. And I began to understand that the absence of imagery was not protection. It was containment, not of what lay below, but of us, of our need to see something and name it. Because the moment we did, the rules would no longer matter, and whatever waited in the depth would finally know that we were looking for it. The first sign was not pain. That was what confused everyone at first. No joint stiffness, no vertigo, no skin mottling, no neurological flags. By every medical standard, we were fine. But people were changing. It started small. Missed words during conversation. Pauses where answers should have been immediate. A diver would be asked a simple question and respond a beat too late. Not confused, just delayed. The medical staff logged it quietly. Observation only. No intervention. That alone was unusual. Offshore medicine is aggressive about early signs. You treat first. You do not wait. Here, waiting was policy. One diver forgot the name of his hometown during a routine check-in call. Not permanently. He remembered later. But the pause lingered. Another diver stopped reacting emotionally to news from home. A family emergency that should have rattled him barely registered. He acknowledged it, then returned to his meal. No distress, just absence. The medical team increased monitoring. More check-ins, more cognitive tests. Still no treatment. I asked one of the medics why they were not intervening. He showed me a separate binder, not the one issued to divers. A medical protocol manual. It addressed behavioral drift rather than injury, baseline deviation rather than illness. There were no medications listed, no corrective procedures, only observation thresholds. If a diver reached a certain level of change, they were reassigned. Not treated, removed from exposure. I asked what exposure meant. The medic said depth, not pressure. Depth. That distinction mattered. I began paying closer attention to myself. At first, I did not notice anything. Then I realized I had stopped dreaming. Or rather, I could not remember dreams anymore. Sleep came. Sleep went. Nothing lingered. That had never happened to me before. I also noticed my emotions felt flatter. Not numb. Muted. Like someone had turned down the volume. Things that should have bothered me did not. The missing diver. The rules. The sound. They felt distant. That scared me. Because fear had been my anchor. Fear kept you careful. Without it, depth became seductive. The medics ran cognitive tests on me. Memory recall. Pattern recognition. I scored within normal range. But barely. They logged it. No treatment. One of the senior medics spoke to me privately. He said pressure sickness was the wrong term. There was no damage. No trauma. The changes were adaptive. The human brain was adjusting to prolonged exposure to something it was not built to process. Not pressure. Presence. I asked what presence meant. He did not answer. He told me the Leviathan was never named in medical records. Naming created focus. Focus created recognition. Recognition created response. That response was not physical. It was relational. The Leviathan did not harm tissue. It altered attention. It compressed awareness. Like pressure compressed gas. Your mind became denser. Less expansive. More efficient. Less human. The longer you stayed at depth, the more pronounced the effect. That was why rotation schedules shortened over time. Not because of danger. Because of change. I noticed speech patterns shifting around me. Shorter sentences. Less metaphor. People spoke like the rules were listening. Direct. Neutral. Even jokes became rare. Humor relied on shared assumptions. Assumptions were dangerous. One diver laughed during a briefing. The sound felt wrong. Too loud. Too sharp. He stopped himself immediately. Apologized. No one acknowledged it. I began to recognize the same flattening in myself. I stopped calling home as often. Not because I did not care. Because the connection felt unnecessary. Distance felt natural. That frightened me more than any imagined creature. The ocean was not crushing us. It was simplifying us. Removing excess. Removing curiosity. Removing attachment. The medics monitored hormone levels. Stress indicators. Everything normal. Too normal. That was the problem. I overheard a conversation between two doctors late one night. They spoke quietly. They said the operation used to lose divers to panic. Now it lost them to acceptance. Acceptance was worse. Panic made people surface. Acceptance made them stay. I asked one of the medics how many people had been reassigned. He told me not many. Most never reached the threshold. I asked what happened to those who did. He said they were moved to surface roles. I asked if they recovered. He hesitated. Then he said recovery was not the goal. Containment was. The Leviathan did not need bodies. It needed awareness. Pressure sickness without symptoms was how awareness was redistributed. Spread thin. Diluted. The rules were designed to slow that process. Not stop it. That was impossible. I felt it then. A moment during a dive when the sound returned. Low. Familiar. Instead of fear, I felt recognition forming. Not visual. Conceptual. Like a pattern clicking into place. I pulled back immediately, terminated the dive, logged neutral data. The medics noted the spike in my attention metrics. Still no treatment, just observation. That night, I forced myself to remember why I was there. The surface, my life before. It felt distant, like a story someone else had told me. I realized then that the greatest danger was not death. It was becoming compatible. The Leviathan did not need to be seen. It reshaped those who stayed long enough. Pressure did not bend steel evenly. It found weaknesses. So did depth. The changes were not illness. They were alignment. And the more aligned you became, the less reason you felt to leave. That was why the rules existed. Not to protect us from harm, but to preserve enough of ourselves to still want escape. I began writing small notes to myself. Reminders, names, memories, anchors, because the pressure was not trying to break me. It was trying to keep me. And the most frightening thing I realized was how easy it would be to let it. The dive began as routine maintenance. Tool check, line inspection, nothing out of scope. The depth was familiar by now. Too familiar. I descended along the guideline with practiced efficiency. The water felt dense, not heavy, intent. I ignored that thought immediately. The rules warned against assigning feeling to environment. At the seafloor, sediment lay undisturbed. Fine particles settled evenly across the surface. No current, no drift, perfect stillness. That was when the water moved. Not suddenly, not violently. It shifted. The sediment lifted in a wide arc beneath me. Not a cloud, a wave. Slow, measured. It rose, paused, then settled again. My instruments showed no current change, no pressure spike. The rules triggered in my mind before fear did. Freeze. Do not track movement. Maintain orientation. I locked my joints and held position. The water moved again. This time closer. The sediment responded like it was being breathed on. In and out. In and out. Rhythmic. The scale was wrong. Currents do not breathe. I focused on the structure in front of me. Bolts. Metal seams. Anything solid. The sound returned. Low. Familiar. Not louder. Clearer. My chest tightened. The rule said do not listen. But listening was happening whether I wanted it or not. I counted my breaths, forced my attention upward. The sediment lifted again. Closer still. I felt it through my suit. Not pressure. Displacement. Water moved around something massive. Something slow enough to be patient. The rules did not say what to do if movement continued. They assumed compliance would end it. It did not. I felt the urge then. Strong. Instinctive. To look. Not down. Around. To orient myself to the source. That urge felt older than training. Older than fear. The desire to understand scale. I broke the rule. Not completely. Just enough. I shifted my helmet angle a few degrees. The lights did not reveal a shape. They revealed absence. A volume where water should have been. The sediment curved around it. The way dust curves around a moving truck. The thing itself was not visible. Its effect was. My mind tried to fill the gap. I stopped it. Too late. Recognition brushed the edge of my awareness. Not visual. Conceptual. Big, not size. Presence. The sound changed. The intervals tightened, as if attention had been returned. My heart rate spiked. The supervisor's voice cut through comms immediately. Freeze. I froze. The movement slowed. The sediment settled. The sound dulled. I did not look again. I did not need to. The impression lingered. The certainty that something vast had shifted position. Not toward me. Near me. As if proximity itself was the interaction. The supervisor ordered immediate ascent. No questions. No explanations. As I rose, the water resisted slightly. Not drag. Reluctance. The sensation faded only after significant distance. Back in the chamber, decompression felt longer than usual. Time stretched. No one spoke. The supervisor reviewed the dive footage. There was nothing to see. No anomaly. No movement. Just empty water and sediment behaving normally. I knew better. So did everyone else. The supervisor asked one question. Did you track the movement? I hesitated. A fraction too long. He noticed. I said no. He held my gaze. Then nodded. Later, a senior diver pulled me aside. He did not reprimand me. He did not warn me. He asked how close it felt. That question told me he knew. I said close enough. He nodded once. He said that was closer than most got. I asked what it was. He shook his head. He said it was not a what. It was a boundary condition. A presence that displaced environment by existing. The rules were written after divers tried to understand it. Understanding was the mistake. I lay in my bunk that night replaying the sensation. Not the image. The scale. The way the water had moved like it was accommodating something. The way the sound had responded to attention. I realized then that the Leviathan did not hide. It did not need to. It occupied space too large to fit into perception cleanly. Looking directly would not reveal it. It would collapse you instead. The movement was not a warning. It was a reminder. Of proximity. Of patience. The closest approach did not involve sight. It involved realization. And realization was the first step toward acknowledgement. I wrote this down carefully. Without adjectives. Without metaphor. Because even describing the movement felt dangerous. The thing that moved the water did not chase. It did not threaten. It adjusted. And that was worse. Because adjustment meant awareness. And awareness meant the rules were not about avoidance. They were about restraint. The next dive was postponed. No reason given. I did not ask. I had already come too close. Closer than I ever intended. And I knew with absolute certainty. The water would move again. Not because I was there, but because it always was. Waiting. Breathing. Occupying the dark. And the only thing keeping it distant was my refusal to turn and look long enough to understand what I was sharing space with. That refusal was all that remained between me and acknowledgement. And now that I knew how thin that line was, I understood why no one ever crossed it twice. I did not mean to access the old logs. That is what I told myself at first. The archive terminal was tucked into a side room near systems control. Rarely used. Rarely monitored. Most data we worked with was live or recent. Operational. Disposable. This was different. The archive required a separate login. Clearance I did not technically have. but the system accepted my credentials anyway. That should have been my warning. The earliest entries were decades old, from a time when the operation had a different name, different objectives. Back then, the language was confident. Exploratory mission, anomalous deep-sea structure, potential biological significance. They called it a find. They treated the depth like a frontier. The first logs described excitement, curiosity, ambition. Divers were sent deeper than any before them. Not cautiously, eagerly. They recorded everything: sound, movement, visual anomalies. They described patterns freely, compared shapes, used metaphors. The casualty reports began early. Equipment failures that did not behave like failures. Divers who surfaced with no recollection of descent. Others who never surfaced at all. At first, these losses were attributed to inexperience. Then bad luck. Then something harder to explain. I watched the language change. Slowly, painfully. Words like creature and organism disappeared, replaced by terms like presence and condition. Eventually, even those vanished. The logs stopped asking what it was. They started asking how to stay away from it. One entry stood out. A diver had written a personal note in the margin of an official report. I see it now when I am not trying to see it. That diver was removed from the program shortly after. The report that followed listed no cause, just reassignment. The first version of the rule appeared soon after. It was shorter then. Never acknowledge what moves below. No name, no emphasis, just a warning. Later logs showed attempts to refine procedures, to outthink the phenomenon. They tried different depths, different equipment, different crews. Nothing worked. Every attempt to study resulted in loss. Not always immediate. Some divers changed over time. They became quieter, more focused, less interested in returning to the surface. Those divers were reassigned too. The operation shifted from discovery to mitigation, from curiosity to control. The rule expanded. Never acknowledge became never define. Never define became never describe. Never describe became never focus. The language grew clinical, as if removing emotion could remove risk. I realized then that the Leviathan was not named to glorify it. It was named to simplify communication. A placeholder, something to reference without explanation. The logs made one thing clear. The phenomenon had been encountered long before modern technology. There were references to older expeditions, submersibles, even early bathysphere dives. The same patterns appeared. Sound before movement, movement before recognition, recognition before loss. The operation existed not to contain the Leviathan itself. That was impossible. It existed to contain human response, to keep distance, not physical distance, cognitive distance. The most recent logs stopped describing events entirely. They only tracked compliance rates, rule adherence, exposure duration, behavioral drift. The Leviathan was no longer the subject. It was the constant. I understood then why the supervisor never explained the mission. There was nothing left to explain. The rules were the mission. Everything else was maintenance. I logged out of the archive and sat in the dark room for a long time. The weight of history pressed on me. Not fear, responsibility. People had died trying to understand something that did not need to be understood. They had mistaken presence for invitation. The operation had learned the hard way. Distance was safety. Ignorance was survival. Not ignorance of existence. Ignorance of meaning. The Leviathan did not need to be studied. It needed to be left alone. And humans needed to be reminded of their limits. I returned to my bunk and reread the binder. The rules felt different now. Less arbitrary. More desperate. Each line represented a failure. A life lost. A lesson paid for in blood and silence. Never acknowledge. Not because it was dangerous to look, but because looking changed the relationship. The Leviathan did not emerge. It did not attack. It responded. And response meant engagement. Engagement meant loss of control. The operation was not a secret research project. It was a buffer, a way to keep curious minds from pushing too far, a way to keep the phenomenon buried in routine. I slept poorly that night, not from fear, from understanding. The Leviathan was not a monster hiding in the dark. It was a presence that had always been there, waiting for someone to decide it mattered. The rules existed to make sure no one ever did. And now that I knew their origin, I understood something else. The logs ended abruptly. No final conclusion. No victory. Just continuation. The operation had no end date. Because the Leviathan was not a problem to solve. It was a condition to manage. As old as the ocean. As patient as depth. And the only thing standing between humanity and acknowledgement was discipline, routine, and the refusal to look long enough to decide what we were really dealing with. The rules were not born from fear. They were born from experience. And experience had taught them one undeniable truth. Distance was the only thing that ever worked. The rules never said acknowledgement required sight. That was something I finally understood after reading them again with the archives in mind. Acknowledgement was defined by awareness. Not seeing, not hearing, recognizing. The binder described it indirectly. Through consequences rather than causes. If recognition occurs, disengage. If disengagement fails, withdraw. If withdrawal is impossible, remain neutral. Neutral was a word that appeared often. Neutral meant uninteresting, unclassified, incidental. That was the goal, to remain part of the background. I learned this during a dive that should not have mattered. Shallow compared to others. Routine task. Minimal exposure time. I was repairing a sensor mount near the seafloor. The work was precise but boring. My attention drifted. That was the mistake. I found myself thinking about the pattern of previous dives. The sound intervals. The sediment movement. I was not looking for it. I was connecting things. The moment that connection formed, the environment changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. The sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Complete absence. My instrument stabilized at once. Minor fluctuations vanished. Readings flattened. Too perfect. Anyone trained to trust equipment knows this feeling. When noise disappears entirely, something is wrong. The water felt still in a way that had nothing to do with currents. It felt attentive. I became aware of my own awareness. That loop tightened in my chest. I had not seen anything. I had not heard anything. But I understood something. And understanding was enough. The rules were clear about this. Disengage. I focused on the task immediately. Forced my thoughts into procedure. Counted bolts. Measured torque. The silence persisted. That was worse than sound. Sound could be ignored. Silence felt deliberate. I realized then that the Leviathan did not announce itself. It waited for classification. The moment you decided it was something, it responded. Not aggressively. Precisely. I felt the urge to check my surroundings. To confirm. That urge was the trap. Confirmation completed acknowledgement. I kept my head down. The supervisor spoke through comms. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. He asked if I was experiencing environmental clarity. That phrase was not in the standard protocols. I answered no. The silence stretched. Then the sound returned. Low. Distant. Normal. My instruments returned to their usual imperfect state. Noise crept back in. The world felt less focused. The supervisor ordered immediate assent. No explanation. Back in the chamber, decompression passed without incident. No one mentioned the silence, but the medical team ran additional cognitive checks. They asked about pattern recognition, about moments of clarity. I answered carefully. Neutral language. No interpretation. One of the medics watched me closely. He told me something quietly. He said the Leviathan did not hunt. It did not pursue. It did not need to. Most divers were incidental. Background noise. They came and went without classification. Only a few crossed the line. Those who noticed patterns. Those who wondered why. Those who began to see consistency where randomness should exist. That was when the Leviathan noticed back. Not as prey, as signal. The danger was not death. It was being sorted. Once you were sorted, you no longer blended into the environment. You became distinct. The veteran who disappeared had crossed that threshold. So had others before him. I reviewed the rules again. A sentence stood out that I had skimmed before. The environment does not respond to action. It responds to attention. That explained everything. Why sound changed. Why cameras failed. Why pressure felt uneven. The Leviathan was not a creature moving through water. It was a condition that reacted to being observed. Like a system stabilizing once measured. I began guarding my thoughts. Not just my actions. I avoided speculation. Avoided mental rehearsal. Avoided curiosity. That was harder than following physical rules. Curiosity was automatic. I learned to interrupt it. When patterns began forming, I shut them down. When thoughts connected, I broke them apart. I became less myself. That was the cost. The medics noted improvement. Stability. That word again. Stability meant I was no longer interesting. That brought relief. And shame. Because part of me wanted to understand. Wanted to know what existed at that depth. But understanding came with classification. Classification came with response. And response meant you were no longer incidental. I realized then that the Leviathan did not exist as a threat to humanity. It existed as a filter, separating noise from signal. Most people pass through life unnoticed. A few began to see too clearly. Those few attracted attention. Not malicious, evaluative. And once evaluated, you were no longer free to leave. The silence during that dive stayed with me. Not as fear, as memory. A moment where the ocean felt empty because it was focused elsewhere. On me. That was when I understood the true purpose of the rules. They were not to stop us from seeing. They were to stop us from thinking clearly enough to be noticed. The Leviathan did not care about bodies. It cared about awareness. And awareness was rare. That made it valuable. I resolved then to remain incidental, to blend back into noise, to let patterns dissolve. Because the moment the environment quieted again, the moment everything aligned too perfectly, I knew that meant I had been noticed. And being noticed was the first step toward never leaving the depth at all. The Leviathan listened, patiently, and the only way to survive was to never give it a reason to keep listening to you. I started noticing them once I knew what to look for. They were not obvious at first. No physical markers, no uniforms or badges. Just time. They had been here too long. On paper, rotations were strict. Weeks at depth. Mandatory surface intervals. Psych evaluations. Reassignment. But some names never left the roster. They shifted roles instead. Dive to supervision. Supervision to monitoring. Monitoring to maintenance. Always staying below operational depth limits. Always present. They moved with a calm that did not come from confidence. It came from acceptance. These crew members did not complain about the rules. They did not question procedures. They did not speculate. They followed everything perfectly. Not out of discipline, out of necessity. I spoke to one of them during a maintenance cycle, an older technician who rarely left systems control. I asked him how long he had been aboard. He paused, then said long enough. That was not evasive. That was careful. I asked why he never rotated out. He looked at me for a long time before answering. Then he said the surface was louder. I did not understand at first. He explained slowly. At depth, attention dissipated. The Leviathan's focus spread thin. Awareness blurred back into background noise. At the surface, clarity returned. So did attention. He told me that once you crossed a certain threshold, you never fully became incidental again. Depth diluted awareness. Distance made it manageable. Leaving meant becoming distinct. That was dangerous. I asked him if he meant the Leviathan followed people. He shook his head. He said it did not need to. Awareness carried itself. Once you had been noticed, the environment everywhere felt different. Sharper, quieter at the wrong moments. Responsive. The surface world became unstable. People who stayed too long learned this the hard way. They tried to leave. They could not sleep, could not focus, could not ignore patterns. Some returned voluntarily. Others were reassigned back here quietly. The operation did not advertise this. It did not need to. The crew learned. Those who stayed did so because it was safer. Not safer in a physical sense. Safer cognitively. At depth, the Leviathan's attention diffused. The water carried it away. The surface reflected it back. That realization changed how I saw the vessel. This was not just a work site. It was insulation. A buffer zone. A place where awareness could be thinned out. The crew who stayed too long were not trapped by force. They were anchored by relief. I began noticing subtle differences in them. Their speech was precise, minimal, functional. They avoided abstract conversation, avoided philosophy, avoided speculation, anything that encouraged pattern building. They lived inside routine. Routine was protection. One of them told me something during a rare candid moment. He said the operation did not keep them here. The Leviathan did. Not directly, by making the outside world unbearable. I asked what happened if someone insisted on leaving. He said they were allowed to. No resistance. No punishment. They just did not last long. Accidents. Mental breakdowns. Disappearances. Not dramatic. Just quiet failures. The operation tracked them for a while, then stopped. Once someone left depth long enough, they were no longer manageable. The crew who stayed understood the bargain. Depth in exchange for stability. Compliance in exchange for anonymity. The vessel was both shield and cell. I realized then why no one spoke of escape. Escape implied a place safer than here. There was none. Not once awareness had been established. I began to feel the pull myself. Not a desire to stay forever. A reluctance to leave. The thought of the surface felt exposed. Bright. Unfiltered. I imagined silence snapping into focus again. Instruments stabilizing. The environment listening. That frightened me more than depth ever had. The crew who stayed too long had already crossed that line. They were not waiting for permission to leave. They were waiting for relevance to fade. Some hoped it would. Others knew it would not. Those were the calmest ones. The operation did not promise release. It promised maintenance. Keep things as they were. Keep attention spread thin. That was the real mission. Not to study the Leviathan. Not to contain it. To live where its attention could not fully settle. The deeper I understood this, the more I saw the vessel differently. Every system was designed for endurance. Every rule for repetition. Nothing was meant to conclude. Only continue. The crew who stayed too long were proof that the rules worked. At a cost. They had traded the surface for stability. The rest of us were still pretending we had a choice. I did not know yet which category I belonged to. But I knew one thing with certainty. Once you had been noticed, leaving was not freedom. It was exposure. And exposure was far more dangerous than any depth. The Leviathan did not need to keep anyone prisoner. Awareness did that on its own. All the operation did was give those marked a place to remain unseen. Together, quiet, and just deep enough. The assignment appeared on my console without warning. No briefing. No advance notice. Just a depth coordinate and a time. Solo. That alone was unusual. Solo dives were rare here. Not because they were unsafe. Because they removed distraction. I went to the supervisor immediately and asked what the task was. He did not answer directly. He told me to review the rules. That was the first indication that the task did not matter. Preparation was minimal. Standard checks. Redundant systems verified. No special equipment. No experimental sensors. Just me, my suit, and the line. Before sealing the chamber, the supervisor repeated the rules aloud. Slowly. Never acknowledge. Never define. Never focus. His voice carried no warning. Only expectation. As pressure increased, I felt something I had not before. Not discomfort. Anticipation. The chamber opened to water darker than I had ever seen. Not absence of light. Compression of it. The descent line disappeared quickly. I followed it down. Past familiar depths. Past previous limits. My instruments functioned normally. That was wrong. At this depth, something should have degraded. Nothing did. The water felt closer to my body. Not pressure. Proximity. As if space itself was narrowing. I realized then that this was not about maintenance. There was nothing to inspect. Nothing to fix. The dive existed to see how I would behave, to see if I could descend without connecting, without recognizing. The sound was present but faint, barely there, like a held breath. The rules said nothing about this depth, only reminders. Do not linger. Do not orient. Do not seek confirmation. I felt the pressure shift directionally, not from all sides, from below, like standing near a massive object that displaced the air around it. Except this was water, and the displacement was gentle, considerate. That thought was dangerous. I shut it down. I focused on my breathing. The line vibrated slightly, not from current, from movement somewhere beyond perception. I did not look. I could feel the urge building. Not curiosity. Completion. The need to resolve the incomplete sensation. That was the test. Whether I would complete the pattern, or let it remain unfinished. My instrument stabilized again. Perfect readings. The same silence as before. That meant attention. I stopped thinking entirely. I recited procedures in my head. Numbers, sequences, anything mechanical. The silence held. Longer this time. I realized the dive would not end until something changed. Either the environment or me. I chose to remain incidental. I did not look. I did not listen. I existed as equipment. After what felt like far too long, the supervisor spoke. Ascend. Nothing else. As I rose, the pressure eased. The proximity faded. The sound returned to background noise. By the time I reached the chamber, I was shaking. Not from fear, from restraint. Back on board, no debrief occurred. No questions were asked. The supervisor only nodded. Later, a senior crew member told me quietly that not everyone passed that dive. Those who failed did not disappear. They stayed. Permanently. Assigned new roles. No longer scheduled for ascent rotations. The dive had not tested my skill. It had tested my ability to remain unfinished, unresolved, uninteresting. That night, I understood my future here depended on one thing. Not courage, not experience, discipline of thought. Whether I could refuse to complete the idea forming beneath me. Because once you finished that thought, once you decided what was there, you were no longer a visitor. You were a participant. And participants did not leave. I thought the unscheduled dive was the end of it. I was wrong. Understanding does not arrive all at once. It accumulates. Quietly, the next descent took me deeper than before. Not by much. Enough to matter. No announcement was made. No one acknowledged the change. The rules were the same. That should have reassured me. Instead, it told me something had shifted. At that depth, sight stopped being relevant. There was nothing to see. No darkness. No shapes. Just absence of reference. My lights illuminated nothing useful. My instruments behaved perfectly. Too perfectly. That was when comprehension happened. Not as an image. As a structure. I understood without seeing that the Leviathan was not a single thing. Not a creature occupying space the way animals do. It was a condition created by attention. A presence that emerged where observation collapsed scale. Where something too vast to be interpreted became singular only when noticed. The moment you tried to define it, you reduced it. And reduction was interaction. The Leviathan did not move through water. It displaced meaning. That was why cameras failed. Why sound changed? Why pressure felt directional? Those were side effects of attention, meeting something that did not resolve cleanly into form. I did not see it. I did not need to. Understanding arrived as inevitability. Acknowledgement changed outcomes because it completed a circuit. Attention flowed one way until it was returned. Returned attention created symmetry. Symmetry created relationship. And relationship created consequence. The rules existed to preserve asymmetry, to keep human awareness one-sided. Incomplete. Incidental. The Leviathan was not hostile. It was responsive. And responsiveness required input. Recognition was input. I felt the edge of that recognition forming. Not visually. Conceptually. I pushed it away. Focused on process. Numbers. Procedure. The understanding did not vanish. It receded. Like depth itself. I realized then why early expeditions failed. They treated the phenomenon as an object. Objects can be studied. But this was not an object. It was a state that emerged under certain conditions. Attention was one of those conditions. Meaning was another. When divers tried to map it, they fed it. When they named it, they stabilized it. Stabilization made it capable of response. The Leviathan did not exist independently of observation. It existed at the boundary of it. I understood why acknowledgement altered behavior. Recognition anchored it, allowed it to orient. Without recognition, it remained diffuse, unfocused, harmless. The rules were not about avoiding danger. They were about avoiding completion. Never finish the thought. Never close the loop. Never decide what waits below. The depth that day felt calm. Not empty. Balanced. As if something vast remained, suspended just beyond clarity. I did not look. I did not listen. I understood enough. As I ascended, the comprehension stayed with me. That was dangerous. Understanding could exist without acknowledgement. But it made avoidance harder. I began guarding my thoughts more carefully than ever. Understanding was a step away from recognition. Recognition was a step away from response. The Leviathan did not need to be feared. It needed to be left unresolved. That was the hardest rule of all. Humans seek closure. We define to feel safe. Here, definition was the threat. The rules were not about survival. They were about maintaining imbalance. Asymmetry between what we know and what knows us. I realized then that the Leviathan did not wait below. It waited at the edge of attention. Everywhere. The ocean simply made it easier to reach. And the operation existed to make sure no one ever finished reaching. I returned to the chamber changed. Not visibly. Internally. I knew now that I could never explain this to anyone outside. Explanation itself would complete the circuit. That was why the rules used neutral language. Why stories were discouraged. Stories created meaning. Meaning created symmetry. Symmetry created response. The Leviathan did not want worship. It did not want sacrifice. It wanted clarity. And clarity was the one thing we were forbidden to give. So I kept my understanding unfinished. Fragmented. I held it like a shadow. Enough to guide my behavior. Not enough to let it solidify. That was how you survived. Not by ignorance. By restraint. And by accepting that some things existed only as long as you refused to decide what they were. The Leviathan waited. Not below, but in the space between noticing and knowing. And that space was where I learned to live. No one ever sat me down to explain it. There was no meeting, no warning, no formal offer. The choice arrived the way everything else did on that vessel. Quietly, procedurally, my rotation schedule changed. Nothing dramatic, just an adjustment. Surface leave delayed. Depth assignments extended. Monitoring shifts added between dives. On paper, it looked like a staffing issue. In reality, it was a question. I noticed how the supervisor spoke to me differently. Not warmer, not colder, more deliberate. He repeated rules I already knew. Not as reminders, as confirmations. I watched how others navigated this stage. The ones who chose to stay did not announce it. They stopped asking about rotation dates. They stopped packing personal items. Their world narrowed to the vessel and the depth below it. They became stable. The ones who chose to leave were treated with respect. Their exits were efficient. No resistance. They were given clearance. Transport arranged. No one said goodbye. That detail mattered. The Leviathan did not block their path. It did not interfere. It waited. Those who left believed they had escaped. For a while, I spoke to one crew member the night before his departure. He had been here longer than me, long enough to know. I asked him what to expect. He told me the surface felt wrong. Too sharp, too quiet. He said patterns followed him. Not visions, connections, coincidences that felt aligned. He said sleep became difficult. Dreams too clear. Silence too complete. The environment felt responsive. I asked if he planned to come back. He said if he could. That answer frightened me more than any story from the depths, because it meant the choice was not permanent, only delayed. The Leviathan did not punish departure. It allowed it. That was worse. Punishment would imply hostility. This was indifference. The choice was not enforced by threat. It was enforced by consequence. Stay and remain diluted. Leave and become distinct. Avoidance was protection, not confrontation. The rules made that clear. Never acknowledge, not even the choice itself. The morning of my next scheduled ascent, the supervisor handed me revised procedures. They extended my depth cycle. He did not ask if I agreed. He did not need to. If I objected, the ascent would proceed. If I complied, the cycle would continue. That was the choice. I looked at the paper, then at him. He said nothing. I signed. In that moment, I understood why the Leviathan did not coerce. Coercion creates resistance. Resistance creates focus. Focus creates acknowledgement. The Leviathan waited for consent. Implicit, quiet. It waited for you to decide whether you wanted to remain uninteresting or risk clarity. I did not feel trapped. I felt sheltered. That realization disgusted me and comforted me, because fear was gone, replaced by something worse. Practicality. I told myself it was temporary. Everyone did. That was the lie that made it possible. I watched the vessel continue its slow routines. Dive, monitor, log, repeat. No progress, no conclusion, just maintenance of distance. I realized then that avoidance was not passive. It was active restraint, a discipline, one that had to be chosen every day. The Leviathan did not need to push. It only needed to wait until you stopped pulling away. The silence offered the choice again and again. Every dive, every thought, every moment of curiosity. And each time, you either completed the thought, or you let it dissolve. That was the only freedom left. I did not know how long I could keep choosing restraint, but I knew what happened when people stopped. They did not vanish. They stayed, or they left and slowly unraveled. Those were the options. The Leviathan did not speak. It did not bargain. It simply remained present, offering nothing, waiting for you to decide whether you would acknowledge that presence, or pretend it was just depth, just water, just silence. I chose silence, because silence was the only place where the Leviathan could not fully take shape. And as long as it remained unfinished, so did I. I am writing this because distance is temporary. That is the truth no one says out loud. Assignments end. Rotations close. Vessels move on. Depth does not follow you forever. At some point, everyone surfaces. The rules discourage records for a reason. Documentation stabilizes ideas. Stability invites recognition. I understand that now. So what I am doing here is dangerous. But silence carries its own risk. I am not writing to explain what waits below. I am not writing to define it. I am writing to create friction, to slow the moment where curiosity becomes certainty. Writing, done carefully, can scatter meaning instead of completing it. That is my intention. I choose my words the way the rules taught me to choose actions. Neutral, incomplete, unfinished. I avoid detail where detail would clarify. I avoid imagery where imagery would anchor. This is not a confession. It is a warning shaped like a story. I am documenting this now because I have already felt the pull of clarity return. Even here, away from the vessel, the world feels sharper at the wrong moments. Silence arrives too cleanly. Patterns suggest themselves without effort. Those are early signs. The medics warned us without naming it. Distance thins attention, but it does not erase it. Writing is a way to redirect that attention outward, to spread it thin again. I am careful not to write for belief. Belief is irrelevant. The Leviathan does not require belief. It requires awareness. Belief follows awareness, not the other way around. That is why disbelief offers no protection. Dismissing this as fiction is safer than believing it. That is not irony. It is instruction. If you are reading this and looking for proof, stop. If you are searching for patterns, stop. If you feel the urge to decide what this is, stop. Treat this as metaphor. Treat it as stress. Treat it as imagination shaped by isolation. That is the safest interpretation. I am writing because stories move differently than data. Data sharpens. Stories blur. A story allows contradictions to coexist. That is protective. The rules discouraged records because records resolve uncertainty. This is not a record. It is an account designed to fray at the edges. I am not telling you where this happened. I am not telling you when. Those details would anchor the experience in the world. Anchors are dangerous. I am also writing because I know what happens when no warning exists. People stumble into clarity by accident. They connect dots without knowing the cost. The operation exists to prevent that. Out here, there is no operation. No buffer. Only routine and distraction. Writing gives me both. It keeps my thoughts from aligning too cleanly. It gives them somewhere else to go. I choose to frame this as a warning because warnings are read defensively. Revelations are read with hunger. Hunger is the problem. Curiosity sharpens attention. Attention invites response. I will not describe what the Leviathan is. Not because I cannot. Because description would complete the circuit. Even now, I feel the temptation to explain. To make it make sense. That urge is the same one that pulled divers past the rules. Understanding feels like relief. It is not. It is exposure. I have learned that awareness can be managed, but not removed. The best you can do is refuse to let it settle. Refuse to let it become clean. Refuse to let it form a single shape. This account is deliberately uneven. That is on purpose. If parts feel unclear, let them remain that way. Do not reread to clarify. Do not compare sections. Do not build a model. The Leviathan does not seek belief. It does not seek followers. It seeks definition. And definition is the one thing you should not give. If you have never worked at depth, that is good. If you have never felt pressure without pain, that is better. If you have never noticed silence arriving too precisely, keep it that way. Dismiss this as a story. Dismiss me as unreliable. That dismissal is protection. I am not trying to convince you. I am trying to slow you down. Because the danger does not arrive with fear. It arrives with clarity. With the moment where everything clicks. If that moment comes, look away. Not physically. Conceptually. Break the thought. Distract yourself. Return to routine. Noise is safer than silence. Imprecision is safer than truth. I am writing now because I will not always have the luxury of distance. At some point, I may need to stop. Not because I am told to. Because continuing would mean I am completing something. If that happens, this account ends. Not with resolution. With absence. That is the safest ending. If you take anything from this, take this. Do not finish the thought. Do not decide what waits beneath systems too large to comprehend. Do not name what does not need a name. And if this ever feels uncomfortably precise, close it. That discomfort is a signal. Not of danger. Of proximity. Treat this as metaphor. Treat it as fiction. Treat it as a story told by someone who spent too long underwater. That choice will keep you incidental. And being incidental is the only protection that has ever worked. I am writing this now because I still can. Because my awareness has not fully aligned. Because distance still helps. And because once the silence begins to feel too clean again, I will need to stop. Before writing becomes acknowledgement. Before warning becomes definition. Before this turns into something the rules were written to prevent. That is why I am writing this now. And that is why you should not read it twice. There was one rule that never appeared in the binder. Not because it was forgotten. Because writing it down would have defeated its purpose. I understood it only after everything else. After the dives. After the silence. After the choice. The final rule was not about depth. It was about pattern. If you recognize intention beneath systems too large to understand, disengage. Not investigate. Not confirm. Disengage. This rule does not belong only to the ocean. That is what took me the longest to accept. The Leviathan below was not unique. It was an example. A demonstration of what happens when scale exceeds comprehension and attention fills the gap. Large systems behave strangely when observed too closely. Networks, infrastructures, crowds, markets, ecosystems. When you start assigning intention to something vast and impersonal, you begin a relationship. Relationships change behavior. Behavior invites response. Response creates feedback. Feedback creates escalation. That is how acknowledgement spreads. The Leviathan existed where meaning was applied to something that did not require it. It did not need permission to exist. Naming it was the mistake. The operation understood this. That was why the rules focused on behavior rather than explanation. They taught restraint. They taught distance. They taught you how to live alongside something without engaging it. The final rule was implied everywhere but written nowhere. Do not finish the pattern. Do not let coincidence harden into purpose. Do not let scale collapse into a single idea. If something feels like it is watching back, step away. Not because it is hostile, because attention itself changes the system. I have seen people apply the wrong lesson. They think the danger is hidden intelligence, a monster, a god, something waiting to be revealed. That belief is comforting. It gives the mind a shape to hold. The truth is less dramatic and far more dangerous. The danger is relationship. The moment you decide something vast has intent, you enter into exchange. The Leviathan did not act until it was acknowledged. Before that, it was diffuse, unfocused, harmless. Acknowledgement gave it edges. Edges allowed response. Response allowed consequence. This applies anywhere scale overwhelms perspective. If you find yourself believing that a system knows you, stop. If you feel chosen by patterns, stop. If silence begins to feel deliberate, stop. These are signs not of discovery, but of engagement. Engagement is what the rules were designed to prevent. I think about the crew who stayed too long. They did not fail. They adapted. They learned how to live where attention could not settle. They understood the final rule without ever saying it. Stay uninteresting. Stay incomplete. Stay unfinished. That is survival. I have tried to carry this lesson with me away from the water. I avoid assigning meaning where scale explains enough. I interrupt patterns before they solidify. I choose noise over clarity, imprecision over certainty. These are not weaknesses. They are shields. The Leviathan below was never the threat. It was a mirror, a demonstration of how human attention can turn environment into relationship. Once you understand that, the final rule becomes obvious. Do not name what does not need a name. Do not complete what remains safely unresolved. Do not assume intention where complexity is sufficient. Because survival does not depend on defeating what waits in the dark. It depends on refusing to decide that it is waiting for you at all. That is the final rule. It was never written down. Because once you understand it, you no longer need it explained. And once you try to explain it, you are already too close.